In a room shimmering with crystal chandeliers and whispered promises of power, a single sentence shattered everything. A high-profile, untouchable CEO leaned in and spat out a cruel insult at a young black waitress. Just one word: stupid. And in that instant, the $3.5 billion deal he'd orchestrated slipped through his fingers. Within moments, the tables turned. Wall Street trembled, investors recoiled, and headlines screamed betrayal. Who was she, the woman behind that simple insult? And how could one careless remark unleash a financial hurricane that centralized not in the boardroom, but in the heart of a humble server? Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Naomi Ellis had only intended to finish her shift, collect her tips, and return home to a quiet apartment, far away from the noise of men in tailored suits and women in glittering gowns. But when that insult cut across the dinner floor, her name became the center of a storm that none of those present could have imagined. Within minutes, phones were raised, recordings were made, and what should have been an evening of celebration turned into the beginning of one of the most expensive mistakes in corporate history. As word spread beyond those four walls, the market shifted, news outlets scrambled for details, and the reputation of a man once considered untouchable began to crack. Yet the question remained: who was Naomi Ellis, the woman he humiliated in front of the elite? Why did one cruel remark hold the power to unravel a deal worth $3.5 billion? And perhaps more importantly, what hidden truth about her life and her connections would turn this dinner into a disaster that shook Wall Street at its very foundation? Stay tuned, because nothing is what it seems. Naomi Ellis's story began far from the glittering lights of Beverly Hills. She was only 7 years old when she was adopted into a modest family in the Midwest, a quiet town where opportunity was scarce and dreams were often exchanged for survival. But Naomi was different, resilient, determined, and unwilling to let circumstance define her. By the time she reached high school, she was already known as the girl who stayed late in the library, who worked shifts at the corner diner to save for college, and who still managed to graduate at the top of her class. Teachers spoke of her as someone destined for more, someone with the sharp mind of a lawyer or the poise of a diplomat. Yet reality had a way of tugging her back. Tuition costs, family obligations, and the weight of simply making ends meet forced her into choices she never expected to make. Dreams of entering law school were shelved, and in their place came nights spent serving cocktails under chandeliers, balancing trays of champagne for guests who barely noticed the young woman behind the polite smile. Working at one of Beverly Hills' most prestigious hotels, Naomi carried herself with a grace that often surprised those who looked past her uniform. Quiet, observant, and disciplined, she listened more than she spoke, and it was in that silence that she often noticed the smallest details: the unspoken tension between investors, the nervous glance of an assistant when secrets hung too heavy in the air, the arrogance of men who assumed she was invisible. But invisibility, for Naomi, was both a curse and a shield. She had learned early on that power was often exercised by those who underestimated others, and she bore that weight with quiet dignity. What no one in that glittering dining room realized was that Naomi's path had been shaped not by wealth or privilege but by endurance, and endurance, in moments of cruelty, has a way of transforming into strength. Across from Naomi that night stood Charles Drake, a man whose name had become synonymous with wealth and dominance. Born into a world of privilege, Drake had carved a reputation as the billionaire who could bend markets to his will. Ruthless in negotiations, sharp in strategy, and unapologetically arrogant, he was admired by Wall Street and feared by rivals. He walked into that Beverly Hills event like a king surveying his kingdom, each handshake choreographed, each smile calculated, each word designed to remind others of his power. Politicians sought his favor, bankers depended on his investments, and celebrities floated around him like moths to a flame. To most in the room, Charles Drake was untouchable. Yet, beneath the glittering chandeliers, arrogance has a way of revealing itself, and those who rise on the shoulders of pride often fail to see the cracks beneath their own empire. What Charles Drake did not know, as he prepared to close the deal of his career, was that one careless moment, one insult directed at a young woman he deemed beneath him, would not only humiliate Naomi Ellis, but also dismantle everything he had spent a lifetime building. The dinner had been planned for months, a carefully choreographed evening where every guest list was scrutinized, every course selected to impress, and every moment designed to celebrate the brilliance of Charles Drake and the deal he was about to finalize. Investors from across the country had flown in, politicians sat at tables lined with silver cutlery, and celebrities sipped cocktails under golden chandeliers. Naomi Ellis moved gracefully among them, balancing trays of wine with the precision of someone who had perfected the art of going unnoticed. She kept her head down, her smile polite, her movements steady. To most, she was invisible, a shadow weaving through the laughter and boasting of the powerful. But invisibility is fragile, and sometimes all it takes is one mistake, one slip, for the curtain to fall. And that night, it came in the form of a glass of Bordeaux, a crimson drop clinging to the rim before tumbling into Charles Drake's immaculate suit. For a brief moment, time seemed to stop. The conversations dulled, the music softened, and every pair of eyes nearby shifted toward the head of the table. Naomi gasped softly, instantly apologizing, reaching for a napkin, her hands trembling with the weight of embarrassment. To most, it was a simple accident, the kind that happens in crowded rooms when trays are heavy and spaces are narrow. But Charles Drake did not see it that way. His expression hardened, the corner of his jaw tightening as he looked down at the stain spreading across his tailored jacket. His silence, heavy and deliberate, stretched long enough for the air itself to grow thick. And then it came, sharp, cutting, and loud enough to silence the room entirely. "Don't touch me, you stupid black girl." The words cut like glass, echoing against marble floors and crystal chandeliers, leaving behind a silence that even the clinking of glasses could not soften. Gasps rippled through the room as if a current had passed through every guest. Some froze with forks halfway to their lips, others looked down to avoid the piercing discomfort of what had just been said. A few mouths hung open, stunned at the audacity of a man so powerful exposing so much cruelty in a single breath. Naomi stood motionless, her hands tightening around the tray, her eyes cast downward not from shame, but from the quiet strength she had carried her entire life. Around her, whispers began, hushed at first, then rising as phones appeared in hands, screens glowing, recordings capturing what no one could believe they had just witnessed. The humiliation was sharp, raw, but the silence that followed was even more telling. Charles Drake had spoken as though he were untouchable, as though his wealth granted him the power to strip dignity without consequence. But what Charles Drake didn't know was that Naomi Ellis wasn't just any waitress. The silence inside that Beverly Hills ballroom did not last long. By the time dessert was served, the incident had already leapt beyond the walls of the luxury hotel. Dozens of smartphones captured the moment Charles Drake's words fell like poison into the air, and within hours the footage was everywhere. First on Twitter, then Instagram, then splashed across Facebook feeds of people who had never even heard of Drake Nova Technologies before that night. The hashtag, #StandWithNaomi, trended across the United States by dawn, gathering millions of views and igniting a debate that reached from kitchen tables to corporate boardrooms. News anchors sat upright in their studios, repeating the words on air with expressions of disbelief, dissecting every second of the video frame by frame. The outrage was instant, fierce, and unforgiving. For a man who had built an empire on reputation, the collapse began not in quarterly reports or stock charts, but in a single sentence that refused to fade from public memory. Investors reacted with panic, their calls filling the lines of trading desks before the sun even rose. By mid-morning, headlines reported that the $3.5 billion merger between Drake Nova Technologies and Argus Capital was under review. Market analysts described the situation as corporate freefall, noting that confidence in Drake's leadership had been shattered overnight. In private boardrooms, executives whispered that Charles Drake had become too much of a liability, his arrogance costing them not only public trust, but billions in shareholder value. Stock charts flashed red, dropping with every passing hour, while television screens replayed the same chilling moment. Drake's face twisted in anger, Naomi Ellis standing frozen in silence. But Naomi herself said nothing. While reporters camped outside her apartment, while bloggers wrote articles about her life, while strangers demanded to hear her side of the story, Naomi chose quiet. That silence only deepened the mystery. Who was she really? And why was she unwilling to step forward when the entire nation wanted to hear her voice? Journalists dug relentlessly into Naomi's past. They uncovered fragments of her childhood, stories from former classmates who spoke of her intelligence, resilience, and drive. Some questioned whether the meeting between Naomi and Charles Drake was truly accidental. Was she just a waitress caught in the wrong place at the wrong time, or was there more behind her poised silence? Rival executives, already circling Drake's empire like vultures, quietly suggested that the entire evening had been a setup, a carefully orchestrated plan to humiliate him on the very night he intended to finalize his crowning deal. Online commentators speculated about whether Naomi Ellis herself had been planted by someone who wanted Drake's downfall. Conspiracy theories spread faster than facts, each one adding to the fog surrounding her identity. Yet Naomi did not break her silence, not once. And with every day that passed, intrigue grew, for the one truth no one could deny was this: the billionaire's empire was collapsing, and at the very center of it all stood a young woman who had not spoken a single word. For days, speculation swirled around Naomi Ellis. Reporters pieced together fragments of her story. Neighbors described her as polite but private. Co-workers remembered her as focused and reliable. Yet none of these small details explained why her silence carried so much weight, or why the collapse of Charles Drake's empire seemed to orbit around her presence. It was a leak from a financial journalist that broke the story wide open. Naomi Ellis, the young woman humiliated in front of the world, was not simply a hotel waitress. She was the adopted daughter of Elliot Strauss, one of the most powerful financiers in America, and the man whose signature held the final authority over the $3.5 billion merger between Drake Nova Technologies and Argus Capital. In one careless outburst, Charles Drake had not only insulted a woman he believed beneath him, but he had openly disrespected the daughter of the very man he needed most. The arrogance that had carried him through decades of dominance had, in a single instant, placed him on the path to ruin. To the public, the revelation was staggering. Naomi's silence now took on an entirely new meaning. She did not need to defend herself because her presence alone told the story. She had been in that room not by accident but by choice, working undercover at her father's request, observing how executives treated those they deemed powerless, testing the culture of the corporations with which he aligned. Charles Drake had failed the test more spectacularly than anyone could have imagined. Charles hadn't just insulted a waitress, one commentator wrote, their words spreading across front pages and broadcasts. He insulted the daughter of the one man who controlled his billion-dollar deal. The irony was almost poetic. For all his wealth and influence, Charles Drake could not undo what was spoken aloud in that ballroom. Naomi Ellis had stood silently, and yet, her silence became the most powerful voice in the room. It was not rage, not confrontation, but restraint that dismantled the empire of a man who believed himself untouchable. The revelation of Naomi Ellis's true identity sent shockwaves through boardrooms across the country, but nowhere was the impact felt more severely than inside Drake Nova Technologies itself. In an emergency meeting convened just days after the scandal erupted, executives gathered in a glass-walled conference room overlooking the city that once admired Charles Drake as a visionary. The agenda was brief but decisive. Could the company survive with Charles at the helm? Votes were cast not on loyalty but on fear. Fear of the billions already bleeding from the market. Fear of the reputational firestorm that showed no sign of dying down. One by one, hands were raised, until the tally was undeniable. The deal with Argus Capital was canceled. The merger that had promised to redefine Drake's empire was gone, erased not by competitors or economic downturns, but by the weight of one cruel sentence spoken in arrogance. For Charles Drake, it was the beginning of an end he could neither bargain nor bully his way out of. In the weeks that followed, the collapse accelerated. Investors who once courted Charles now abandoned him, distancing their portfolios and reputations from the shadow of his disgrace. Media outlets that once praised his sharp strategies now dissected his downfall, chronicling the rise and fall of a man undone by his own words. Public opinion, once split, tilted decisively against him, while Naomi Ellis became a quiet symbol of dignity and resilience. She never granted interviews, never sought the spotlight, yet her silence spoke louder than any press conference. To those who had watched the scandal unfold, the lesson was clear. One cruel word cost him $3.5 billion. But more than money, it cost him his reputation, something no deal can buy back. And as the cameras faded and the headlines moved on, one truth remained. Because respect isn't optional. It's the only currency that never loses value. And so the story of Charles Drake and Naomi Ellis comes to a close, but the questions it raises remain open for all of us to consider. Was it right that a single sentence, spoken in arrogance and cruelty, erased decades of power, prestige, and wealth? Or was this the purest form of justice, a reminder that respect cannot be bought and dignity cannot be diminished by even the richest among us? The debate raged across living rooms, coffee shops, and digital forums long after the boardroom votes were cast. What do you think? Did Charles truly deserve to lose everything for those words, or was this a warning that had to be delivered for the world to remember? Let us know in the comments below, and if you have ever been underestimated or disrespected, then you know exactly why this story matters. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because stories like these are more than headlines. They are lessons written in the lives of those who lived them. And if you thought this was shocking, wait until you hear about the billionaire who faked his own death to escape justice. That, my friends, is a story you won't want to miss. To truly understand why this moment struck such a chord, we need to step back into the life of Naomi Ellis, a woman whose story was never about fame or fortune, but about resilience in the face of hardship. Born into poverty in the heart of Atlanta, Naomi's earliest years were marked by instability and loss. Adopted at the age of 7 by Elliot Strauss, she was given not only a new home but also a chance at a future. Yet, even with a supportive family, Naomi faced obstacles that her peers never imagined. Being one of the few black students in elite private schools, she endured whispers in hallways, subtle exclusions at social gatherings, and the heavy silence of lowered expectations. She studied harder than anyone else, often staying up late into the night under the soft glow of a desk lamp, determined to prove she was worthy of every opportunity. Her quiet determination became her shield, and her patience became her strength. When she later took a part-time job at the luxury Beverly Hills Hotel, it wasn't because she needed the money. It was because she wanted to see firsthand how power operated in its most unguarded moments. It was research, it was training, and it was preparation. But no one in that glittering ballroom could have guessed that the young woman carrying a tray of wine glasses was, in fact, a mirror being held up to their own arrogance. Charles Drake's fall was shocking, but Naomi's presence in that moment was not an accident of chance. Her entire upbringing had prepared her for it. She had grown up listening to Elliot Strauss speak about the hidden culture of corporate America, the egos, the blind spots, the unchecked privilege that shaped deals worth billions. Naomi was observant, reserved, and endlessly resilient, but beneath her quiet nature lay a fierce sense of justice. Her struggles weren't only academic, they were personal. She had faced the sting of racial bias long before Charles uttered his infamous words. Teachers who assumed she would fail, employers who overlooked her potential, strangers who judged her before she even spoke. But each slight only strengthened her resolve. By the time she entered that ballroom, She was not just a young woman serving drinks. She was the embodiment of a generation unwilling to be silent, unwilling to bow, and unwilling to let arrogance go unchallenged. The scandal did not unfold in a vacuum. America itself was watching, and for many, the moment was larger than Charles Drake or Naomi Ellis. It was a reflection of how power, race, and gender still collide in the modern workplace. The cruel words Charles hurled at Naomi echoed centuries of inequality, from segregated lunch counters to glass ceilings still unbroken. For some, it was a painful reminder of battles fought and battles still being fought. For others, it was an awakening, a sudden realization that arrogance at the top can no longer be hidden behind boardroom walls. Investors pulled their money not only because of economics, but because they knew the cultural tide had shifted. Respect was no longer optional, it was demanded. And Naomi, without raising her voice, had become a symbol of that shift. She stood as proof that dignity, once denied, could stand taller than any fortune. History, of course, had seen echoes of this downfall before. When the CEO of Uber was caught on camera berating a driver, public trust in the company faltered, forcing resignations and apologies. When the founders of WeWork indulged in excess while employees struggled, their empire crumbled almost overnight. And across corporate America, lawsuits have revealed stories of racial bias, discrimination, and arrogance that cost companies millions, sometimes billions. Charles Drake's collapse was not isolated. It was part of a larger pattern. A pattern where hubris collides with accountability, and where words once thought disposable become evidence in the court of public opinion. Each case told the same lesson in different forms. Power without respect is temporary, and wealth without humility is fragile. Charles simply became the latest, and perhaps the most dramatic, reminder of that truth. Experts lined up to analyze what had happened. Financial analysts warned that arrogance had become a liability more dangerous than debt. Psychologists explained how a single moment of cruelty reveals deeper flaws in character that cannot be ignored. Historians trace the scandal to a long lineage of empires toppled not by outside enemies, but by leaders who believed themselves untouchable. And in the silence that followed each analysis, the public reflected. Long pauses in living rooms, long stares at television screens, quiet nods of agreement. Because everyone understood, even if only for a moment, that Charles Drake's downfall was not just about business. It was about humanity. Naomi Ellis never raised her voice, never demanded revenge, and never needed to. Her silence carried more weight than his empire ever could. And as the story closes, one truth remains. Respect is the only currency that never loses its value.